What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Man, I gotta tell you guys, Superman Reborn is... God, it's the best thing coming out of DC Rebirth right now. And I mean it this time. I mean, it's like for real this time though. Like, it's such a good story and it wraps up so many plot points in a really good way, but it also leaves us hanging and wanting more. And that's really one of the issues that a lot of stories suffer from. A lot of stories suffer from the issue of, hey guys, here's a story with a character, and then we get a linear kind of storytelling, and then all the threads are wrapped up. It doesn't really leave us wanting more. It doesn't leave us on the edge of our seat wondering what happens next. That's one of the reasons why I love Injustice so much, is because the different volumes just kind of end with you wondering, you know, what happens? Well, Alfred gets killed. And so you're just kind of like, oh God, what happens next? I mean, it gives you these really, really great moments. And that's what I love so much about this, because when it comes to the idea of Superman as a character, you know, I think Max Landis said it best when he said the Superman means something to people. And so with the story, it kind of gives us this return of the Superman that we all know and love, combined with the return of the the New 52 Superman kind of merging and coming together. But we'll get to that here in a second. So remember, the underlying theme of DC Rebirth right now is Dr. Manhattan and the Watchmen. We really don't know what their investigation is. We don't know if someone like stole the powers of Dr. Manhattan and they're using them. We don't know if it's actually Dr. Manhattan. All we really know is that Dr. Manhattan and Mr. Oz, presumably Ozymandias, have something to do with what's going on in DC Rebirth, and somehow, somewhere along the line, 10 years were stolen away from everybody. And so again, what Mr. Oz had been doing was basically kind of traveling around, finding individuals he considered to be either threatening or anomalies or something like that, and then taking them and locking them away. This was commonly done with individuals who were of extreme significance or who were pre-New 52 characters. For example, Doomsday showing up at the, in the first run of Action Comics with regards to him and Superman fighting was considered to be an anomaly, because as far as we could tell, that was the pre-New 52 Doomsday. And so Mr. Oz rounded this guy up, threw him in a containment cell, and that was that. It was the same thing, you know, with Tim Drake. Everybody thinks Tim Drake's dead, but Tim Drake's very much alive. But what happens is these guys begin taunting Mr. Oz, and they keep saying he got out. Now, here's the really cool thing about this, is that up until the reveal of Clark Kent, everybody thought it was Superboy Prime. And that was kind of the funny thing, because this was really just kind of like Tomasi and everybody just sort of toying with us. You know, it was basically, you know, you had all these different writings on the wall. Superman will save me. Superman will help me. Whoever it is has this belief that Superman will rescue them, that Superman looks at them and they have this sort of you know, either father-son or friend relationship with one another, but whatever the case may be, they believe Superman will rescue them. And that fits directly into the Superman mythos, right? I mean, we look at like Superman and Lois Lane. You know, Lois Lane is doing some kind of a report, something like that, trips on a wire, falls off a building. No matter where Superman is in the world, he will save her. We know that for a fact. The only exception to that was, you know, Injustice. But in almost every single circumstance, Superman has always saved Lois Lane. And even in Injustice, he was tricked into killing her. It's not like she fell, you know, he just didn't make it there in time. If Lois Lane's life is in jeopardy, Superman will save her. That kind of superhero concept extends into the rest of the world. We know that there are some people out there who were shot and killed every day, and Superman doesn't rescue them. But it's one thing to have like a nameless, faceless person that you know just kind of died off panel somewhere and you never have to think about them. It's another to see these drawings on a wall of a person who's convinced that Superman will save them, only to face the truth of the fact that Superman will not save them. And so again, it really kind of changes things up. But from here, we switch over to Jonathan Kent. Now it's funny because I was in Colorado this weekend hanging out with Comic Story, and I was looking at houses, different things like that. I'm probably going to move out to Colorado. It's a beautiful place. But he and I were talking about DC Rebirth. We were talking about Superman, and we both universally agreed that we are so attached to Jonathan Kent. We love Jonathan Kent. I love Jonathan Kent as a character. He is amazing. And it's hilarious with this, because again, it's really just kind of like a celebration of a birthday, that kind of thing. But then of course, as we know from the lead up, you know, mild-mannered, different things like that, multiplicity, that the mysterious Clark Kent had kind of been like stalking the Superman family, right? Like he was hanging around their home and just being like really, really creepy. He was like the socially awkward guy that a girl makes the mistake of going on a date with, and he just will never leave her alone. I mean, it was just one of those weird kind of situations. And so because of this, what ends up happening is Clark Kent leaves like a family photo book on the doorstep of Superman's home. And when Jonathan picks it up and Jonathan and Lois and Superman begin to go through it, what they find out is this book contains all their memories. Now, this is huge because this says a couple things. One, it says that somebody out there knows about the life and times of Superman before the New 52 happened. He knows their secret. Remember, the pre-New 52 Superman, the pre-New 52 Lois Lane, they've been in hiding, trying to keep their identity secret, where they really come from. They've been trying to keep that secret for the world in order to make sure that Jonathan never has to run into any kind of, major danger or anything like that. That's one of the reasons why Damian Wayne and Super Sons is such a great match for the character, because Damian Wayne knows about, Jonathan Kent, where he comes from and that kind of thing. But what it also does is it says that whoever it is that, left this here is from the pre-New 52 era. They're from the same place that Superman and Lois Lane are. And so it really kind of sends things into a panic. Well, then suddenly the house starts burning down. But the more they look at it, the more they realize it's not really fire so much as it's just kind of like this substance erasing things away. Now, this is when the story, it almost got heartbreaking, because Superman goes to grab Jonathan. Jonathan keeps disappearing and appearing in different locations around the house. Eventually, Superman rescues him, but when he gets him outside, Jonathan begins to kind of erase, kind of disappear. And this is one of the things that the comic story and I were talking about, because we were like, dude, when I was going through the story, I was like, don't you dare kill Jonathan Kent. I swear to God, if Jonathan dies, we riot. It was awesome, for this little tidbit of a moment. And that's why I say these stories are so good, because they keep you on the edge of your seat. You want to know what happens next. What happens to Jonathan? You got to know all these things. Not only that, it seems as though everything about them is being erased. The memories inside, or I guess the photos inside this book, are all gone. I mean, their lives are basically being eradicated. They're being removed in their entirety. Now, of course, at this point, it's really just a matter of, I guess just the process of elimination. In the mind of Superman and Lois Lane, their idea is, okay, look, Clark Kent is the first suspect. We got to go into his apartment. We got to find out what's going on. Now, when they get in there, what they find is basically a home that's virtually barren. No one lives there. No one really occupies the space. It really looks like a hotel room that hasn't been used in years and years and years, save for the fact that the fridge is filled with children's food. Now, the initial inclination here is that if it's filled with children's food, Jonathan Kent's been kidnapped and taken here for the purpose of being held here. That way, this person can just kind of feed Jonathan kids food, keep him happy, keep him quiet, that kind of thing. But then, of course, Clark Kent makes his appearance known, and this is when the questions begin to unroll. This is when they begin to kind of come out. This is when they begin to expand. And what we find out is that this guy Clark Kent, is angry with Superman. And that's the coolest thing here, is because, this guy Clark Kent says, look, I solved your identity problem. I fixed all that stuff for you. I made it so that you wouldn't have to worry about those kinds of things. I've been the hidden hand operating in the shadows this whole time. But in order to pull it off, I had to trick myself. I literally had to turn my world upside down. But in the midst of all of this, you let him capture me. You let him take me away. You let him hold me prisoner. Were you? And that's the coolest thing about this, is because while this is Clark Kent, and while this, we know by now who this guy is, although I won't spoil it for those who have been avoiding spoilers for the last 2 weeks, wanting to know what's going on. While we know who this Clark Kent is, his perception, the way he talks, the way he addresses Superman is a direct reflection of what would happen if someone actually succumbed to an injury, succumbed to, paralysis or something like that, and they expected Superman to save them. Superman is being confronted with every scenario ever when anybody was waiting on Superman and he never came. So that's one of the cool things about this, is because if Superman's confronted by someone who is expecting him to show up and save their life, or, help them out of a situation or keep them from being injured, and Superman didn't arrive, how would that person react? They would react just like this. You left me all alone in that cell. These are the kind of things that we would see. And that's what makes it so cool, is because you could replace this Clark Kent with anybody. He could say the exact same thing. It could be an average Joe walking down the road. It could be Jonathan Kent, the father of Superman, not the son, but the father of Clark Kent. It could be any number of people. You let me die. You didn't do everything you could to save my life. You didn't do this. You didn't do that. And it still works. And that's why it's such a cool thing. But then suddenly we start having, the environment around Superman starts switching around. Now, the first person we see is Lex Luthor. And of course, Superman's being taunted. This guy's saying, say my name. When I first saw Lex Luthor, I was like, oh my God, it's pre-Flashpoint Lex Luthor. And I was so excited. I was so hyped. But then it switches over to Bizarro, then it switches over to Brainiac, then it switches over to Mongol, and I was kind of hoping maybe we would see Superboy Prime. But around this time, I began to realize exactly what it is that's going on. Of course, we get Cyborg Superman, that kind of thing, even Doomsday, and then Superman finally figures out what's happening, that it's Mr. Mxyzptlk, or however the heck it is you pronounce it, but it's Mr. M. And now, of course, again, to me, the clues were there. I mean, the indication that it was Mxyzptlk were there, vanishing, disappearing, wiping people people's memories, things like that. As much as people wanted it to be Superboy Prime, the evidence just wasn't there. At that point, it was really just wishful thinking. It was kind of looking at the evidence saying, well, it's got to be Superboy Prime, and then ignoring contradictory evidence, which is natural. I mean, I'll be honest, I would have been hyped if it was Superboy Prime. I would have been like, yeah, I would have been so fanboy. I would have been so excited if it was Superboy Prime. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I would have loved for it to have been Superboy Prime, but I also like that it's Mr. Mxyzptlk, and the reason why is because this injects a variable, an insane variable, into what could have otherwise been a pretty linear story. And here's what I mean. If the Watchmen are behind everything that's going on with DC Rebirth, and Dr. Manhattan is kind of like the head honcho pulling the strings, then the question becomes, who's stronger, Dr. Manhattan or Mr. Mxyzptlk? It answers, or it brings in a really, really good equation. And the reason why is because, as far as we're aware, there's really not anybody on the same level as Dr. Manhattan in DC Comics, because DC doesn't really emphasize extreme reality warping like Marvel does. You're not gonna find a Franklin Richards in DC Comics. You're not gonna find some kid that can just warp reality on a universal scale. You're not gonna find a Molecule Man. You're not gonna find the Beyonders. I mean, you'll get to like the Presence, you'll get to the Spectre, but even then, in terms of how they interact with people, it's more grounded. It's really more tangible. It's not as extravagant and flamboyant and lavish as you find in Marvel Comics. That doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. It just means we kind of get the best of both worlds. We get to see far out there crazy reality warping stuff, but then we get to see more grounded stuff in DC. And so that's one of the reasons why the companies really kind of work in tandem and kind of benefit one another. But the issue here is that Mxyzptlk really kind of begins to taunt Superman, basically saying, you know, I don't know who you're talking about. I don't know anybody named Jonathan Kent, and then basically goes to disappear. Now, of course, when Superman turns back to Lois doesn't know who Jonathan Kent is. And so at this point, it's really just kind of Superman trying to figure out what's going on, wrapping his head around everything that's happening, and actually beginning to panic a bit. Now, at this point, we switch over to Mxyzptlk's story directly. Now, this is a cool thing because Action Comics 975 was basically, it was an oversized issue. It was really kind of like a double issue in the sense we got two stories crammed into one. So it was like a DC 2-in-1. But what this did is it basically detailed the idea of Mxyzptlk and how it was that he fell into the circumstance that he did. And the reason why is because of the fact that when he had first emerged, when he had really first kind of appeared inside the DC universe, that he was immediately detected by Mr. Oz. And Mr. Oz considered him to be an extremely dangerous person. The reason being because there's nothing Mxyzptlk can't do. He can change anything into anything. I mean, the world is his oyster. You know, humanities, gods, I mean, these are baubles in the hands of Mxyzptlk. You know, they just kind of exist according to his whim. The issue here is that when he was taken and he was thrown inside of his cell, that his powers were effectively neutralized. Now, that seems to have been the case that was going on here with regards to Dr. Manhattan, is that this location where people were being housed, it was designed to specifically neutralize whatever powers it was that they had. In the case of Mxyzptlk, they were designed to basically neutralize his technology, neutralize his ability to manipulate reality, or at least his perception to manipulate reality, and then he was just kind of left on his own. The problem with this was that in his mind, he looked at Superman. He didn't really see him chasing after Superman and causing problems for Superman. He didn't see that as an issue, and he would show up and he would create dangerous situations and so on and so forth. You know, he was basically just a guy who was there to help out, you know, and to have fun. And so he looked at Superman as a friend. He didn't look at him as an enemy. Now, we know that Superman kind of looked at Mxyzptlk as more of like a nuisance than an enemy, more so than anything else. But what DC also does here, and this is beautiful, what they do is they establish that there's only one Mr. Mxyzptlk in the entire DC multiverse, and the whole omniverse of all the multiverses that have ever existed. There's only one Mxyzptlk. The Mxyzptlk that we see in this comic right now is the same one that you saw in Superman the Animated Series. It's the same one that you saw in the different Lego games and movies and so on and so forth that had him featured in there. There's only ever one. And of course, he's repeating all this to Jonathan Kent, but he's saying the relationship between your father and I transcends space and time. But no matter where your father goes, I always run into some variation of him, but there's no one like your father, Superman. So basically, it's Mxyzptlk saying that Superman from Superman the Animated Series is just not as interesting as pre-New 52 Superman. Bizarro Superman is not as interesting. Lego Superman, not as interesting. In the end, Mxyzptlk always finds himself coming back to Superman as we know him, you know, with regards to the pre-New 52. Now, eventually, you know, in his wrath and in his anger and in his irritation and his rage, eventually what he ended up doing was just kind of tearing a bit of a hole in this sort of fabric of space. And what he ended up doing after that was jumping out into the main DC universe, effectively arriving in the New 52. And so what he does is he basically, after meeting with this New 52 Superman, you know, after kind of not really working alongside him, but essentially what Mxyzptlk does is trick himself. You know, he basically just kind of plants a ruse where he makes himself Clark Kent, and then he turns around and wipes his memory of everything that he knows. And so in a sense, Mxyzptlk was Clark Kent. For all he knew, he was Clark Kent. It wasn't until, again, he began to go through the books, but the time that he basically jogged his memory in the mild-mannered story, that he began to realize what it was that he was capable of. Not only that, his wrath and his anger began to come back when he finally realized that Superman had left him hanging, that Superman didn't save him, and that's why this is happening. So to kind of, reiterate this little bit of a linear tale, of course he was captured, he basically managed to free himself and then wiped his memory, making himself Clark Kent in an effort to blend in, to more or less function, and then once his memories were restored, he basically lashed out at Superman. And so again, this is really him just kind of getting his revenge. This is him sort of causing havoc and causing a hassle for Superman himself, as well as Jonathan Kent. It's really Mr. Mxyzptlk just kind of getting his anger and wrath out at Superman with regards to the fact that he felt like he'd been left hanging. Now, at this point, we kind of continue on with, with Superman and Lois trying to find their son. And the reason why is because, again, Lois doesn't know who Jonathan is. Superman, of course, begging and pleading, look, you have to know who he is, but Lois doesn't know. And that's the most crushing thing about this for Superman, is because really his life is just kind of disappearing before his eyes. His son has vanished at the hands of Mxyzptlk. His wife doesn't know that they have a son. These are the things that are kind of crushing, because this is kind of a reflection of us, right? I mean, let's say, for example, that Jonathan Kent was, DC killed his character off. For those of us that became attached to him, things would seem just a little bit darker. They would lack that kind of pop. They would lack that pizzazz, the kind of things that made them just fun and exciting to read. That would go away, and it would be business as usual with a Superman story. But just that one switch of having Superman with a son changes everything. And so because of this, with regards to Superman himself, he looks at this and says the core of his life has basically vanished. And so more or less striking a deal with Mxyzptlk is this idea that if Superman could basically race to the top of this impossible to reach building and rescue his son, that Mxyzptlk will go away, that he'll basically leave Superman alone and will not cause him any more problems. But if Superman fails, if Superman's not able to pull it off, then he loses everything. Now, in the midst of all this happening, in the midst of this taking place, Jonathan Kent is still kind of floating out there, in this little ball space, this little itty bitty area, but he's met with the arrival of the spirits of the New 52 Lois Lane and the New 52 Superman. And so what this does is it tells us that the life energy that makes up Superman is immutable, it's indestructible, it cannot be eliminated. It just kind of passes from one person to the next. And that made sense. I mean, we learned in the Superwoman comics that the New 52 Lois Lane died when her body wasn't able to handle the energy of Superman because she wasn't Kryptonian. It was trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. I mean, you could kind of jam it in there, but ultimately it's just not fit for that. It's not designed for that. And so because of that, her body basically just kind of shut down, and it began to sort of deteriorate and eventually was destroyed because it couldn't handle the power of Superman. At the same time, the New 52 Superman basically just kind of died. And so because of that, their energies, their life forces have kind of been floating out there waiting for DC to do something with them. And so the cool thing is that Jonathan Kent really begins to kind of talk to them. Now, of course, they never had a child. New 52 Superman, New 52 Lois Lane never had a son together. But from the perspective of Jonathan, they see what their life could have been. And so what they do is they kind of, tap into Jonathan a little bit. They don't really give him any extreme level of power, but what they do is they begin the process of sort of kind of merging themselves and setting the stage for kind of like a Superman rebirth in the most literal of ways. Now, at this point, again, this is really DC kind of laying the groundwork for everything that is Superman's life. Because remember, Superman Reborn was billed as a huge event for the Superman mythos in DC Rebirth. And so the idea was to basically give as many people as much information as possible in terms of what Superman was about, what's in continuity, what's not in continuity. And so this is DC, this is Tomasi, everybody sitting down and saying, look, the Superman that you're reading about right now in this story is the pre-New 52 Superman. It's the one who was beat to death by Doomsday and then came back. It's the Superman that had the black suit and the mullet man. It's the Superman that you think of when you think of Superman. That's why this guy is here to stay. And that's the coolest thing, is because in the midst of all this, Superman manages to free his son, right? I mean, he manages to free Jonathan Kent against all odds, with Mxyzptlk saying, you were never supposed to be able to pull that off. You were never supposed to do this. You were, in fact, supposed to just kind of lose energy, lose faith, effectively shut down and die before you ever reached the top of this thing. But in freeing his son and basically saving his son's life, Superman emerges. Basically, it looks like the New 52 Superman shows back up again. And so this has really created a funny situation, because for a lot of people, the question was, well, where do we go from here? What do we do with regards to Superman just sort of popping up on the scene out of nowhere in his New 52 form? Well, in a sense, this is not really what's happening. Instead, it's really just kind of a merger between these two beings, between these two entities. Now, of course, you really have Mxyzptlk and you have Superman kind of hammering it out with one another. Of course, Superman pissed off that Mxyzptlk took his son, but you also have Jonathan with Lois Lane. and the two of them sort of working together. But what we end up finding out is that there was kind of like a switch here, that the New 52 Lois Lane and the New 52 Superman are the ones who are currently here. And so when Jonathan talks to Lois, she doesn't know who he is. She's like, look, we never had a son. I don't know what's going on. And that's kind of funny because now it's Jonathan on the other foot. I mean, he knows who they are. He knows what they look like. He says, look, you're my parents, but in their mind, that's not true. Well, that's why it's DC kind of rectifying things and setting things back to normal, because what he does is he tells Superman, you know, or he tells New 52 Superman and he tells New 52 Lois, you have to believe me. You have to believe that I'm telling the truth. You have to let Superman as I know him and Lois Lane as I know her, you have to let them merge with you. You have to become one singular entity. And that's exactly what happens. The reason why this is called Superman Reborn is because this is the tried and true Superman. This is the tried and true Lois Lane. It's everything people loved about the New 52 Superman merging with the pre-New 52 Superman. It's everything people loved about the New 52 Lois Lane merging with the pre-New 52 Lois Lane. And so what DC is basically doing is they're sitting down and saying, okay, that part of DC is now done. We are now done with the New 52 Lois Lane. We are now done with the New 52 Superman. New 52 Superman isn't some character that's just kind of bobbling out there somewhere and may or may not come back one day. They are now latched on and they are the full-on versions of their characters. And so this really seems to kind of set the stage for the future of what might happen with the rest of DC Comics. And the reason why I say that is because this represents a much larger picture. The New 52 Superman and the pre-New 52 Superman merging into one Superman. The pre-New 52 Lois Lane and the New 52 Lois Lane merging into one Lois Lane. The question has to be asked here, is it that far out of the realm of possibility that the pre-New 52 DC universe and the New 52 DC universe will merge into one singular universe? So we'll kind of get the best of both worlds. We'll get the best of everything, and it'll rectify a lot of these issues. Keep in mind, when the New 52 first launched, Batman wasn't completely rebooted. Batman's whole history was still intact. Green Lantern was the same way. Green Lantern didn't get a reboot. It wasn't like everything started back to zero and it was all done all over again. Green Lantern just continued on from Green Lantern Rebirth in 2005 or whenever it was that Jeff Johns wrote it, and everything going up to that point. So Sinestro Corps War, all those things were still in continuity. But if you were to merge everything together, well then suddenly people start waking up, so to speak. Batman wakes up to his full history. Green Lantern wakes up to his full history. Martian Manhunter, Shazam, they all just start waking up, and suddenly there was no New 52. Everything is just one cohesive universe. But again, the sky's the limit here. And that's why I love this story, is because there's so many possibilities on the direction things could go. If the frontrunner, if the face of DC Comics can be reborn by way of merging his pre-New 52 and his New 52 self, then is it possible for all the other superheroes and the world as a whole, the universe even? But again, it's really just kind of a cool thing because it just kind of sets the stage for the future of the stories, in the sense that we just kind of have this kind of coming together of these two characters. Everything sort of worked the way it was meant to. But again, at this point, we also switch over to Mr. Oz. And Mr. Oz says, you know, is this the direction things are going to go in? Is this the first stage in a universal shift, in a universal change? And if it is, then is he going to be okay with it? Presumably, the person he's talking about is Dr. Manhattan. But with that being said, guys, if you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.